Book One, Chapter 2 of Virginia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Virginia by Ellen Glasgow. Book 1, The Dream. Chapter 2, Her Inheritance. A block away, near the head of High Street, stood the old church of St. James, and at its back, separated by a white paling fence from the squat pinkish tower and the solitary grave in the churchyard, which was that of a Southern soldier who had fallen in the Battle of Dinwiddie, was the oblong wooden rectory in which Gabriel Pendleton had lived since he had exchanged his sword for a prayer book and his worn Confederate uniform for a surplice. The church, which was redeemed from architectural damnation by its sacred cruciform and its low ivied buttresses, where innumerable sparrows nested, cast its shadow on clear days over the beds of bleeding hearts and lilies of the valley in the neglected garden, to the quaint old house with its spreading wings, its outside chimneys, and its sloping shingled roof, from which 5 dormer windows stared in a row over the slender columns of the porch. The garden had been planned in the days when it was easy to put a dozen slaves to uprooting weeds or trimming flower beds, and had passed in later years to the breathless ministrations of Negro infants, whose experience varied from the doubtful innocence of the crawling age to the complete sophistication of 6 or 7 years. Dandelion and wiregrass rioted, in spite of their earnest efforts, over the crooked path from the porch, and periwinkle, once an intruder from the churchyard, spread now in rank disorder down the terraced hillside on the left, where a steep flight of steps fell clear to the narrow cross street, descending gradually into the crowded quarters of the town. Directly in front of the porch, on either side of the path, grew 2 giant paulownia trees, royal at this season in a mantle of violet blossoms, and it was under their arching boughs that the girls stopped when they had entered the garden. Ever since Virginia could remember, she had heard threats of cutting down the paulownias because of the litter the falling petals made in the spring, and ever since she could lisp at all, she had begged her father to spare them, for the sake of the enormous roots into which she had loved to cuddle and hide. "If I were ever to go away, I believe they would cut down these trees," she said now a little wistfully, but she was not thinking of the paulownias. "Why should they, when they give such splendid shade? And besides, they wouldn't do anything you didn't like, for worlds." "Oh, of course they wouldn't, but as soon as I was out of sight, they might persuade themselves that I liked it," answered Virginia, with a tender laugh. Though she was not by nature discerning, there were moments when she surprised Susan by her penetrating insight into the character of her parents, and this insight, which was emotional rather than intellectual, had enabled her to dominate them almost from infancy. Silence fell between them while they gazed through the veil of twilight at the marble shaft above the grave of the Confederate soldier. Then suddenly Susan spoke in a constrained voice, without turning her head. "Jinny, Oliver isn't one bit of a hero, not the kind of hero we used to talk about." It was with difficulty, urged by a vigorous and uncompromising conscience, that she had uttered the words. "And besides," retorted Virginia, merrily, "he's in love with Abby Goode." "I don't believe that. They stayed in the same boarding house once, and you know how Abby is about men." "Yes, I know, and it's just the way men are about Abby." "Well, Oliver isn't, I'm sure. I don't believe he's ever given her more than a thought, and he told me last night that he couldn't abide a bouncing woman." "Does Abby bounce?" "You know she does, dreadfully. But it wasn't because of Abby that I said what I did." Something quivered softly between them, and a petal from the jacqueminot rose in Virginia's hair, fluttered like a crimson moth out into the twilight. "Was it because of him, then?" she asked in a whisper. For a moment Susan did not answer. Her gaze was on the flight of steps, and drawing Virginia with her, she began to walk slowly toward the terrace side of the garden. An old lamplighter, carrying his ladder to a lamp post at the corner, smiled up at them with his sunken, toothless mouth as he went by. "Partly, darling," said Susan. "He is so, I don't know how to make you understand, so unsettled. No, that isn't exactly what I mean." Her fine, serious face showed clear and pale in the twilight. From the high forehead, under the girlish fringe of fair hair, to the thin, firm lips, which were too straight and colourless for beauty, it was the face of a woman who could feel strongly, but whose affections would never blur the definite forms or outlines of life. She looked out upon the world with level, dispassionate eyes, in which there was none of Virginia's uncritical, emotional softness. Temperamentally, she was uncompromisingly honest in her attitude toward the universe, which appeared to her, not as it did to Virginia, in mere formless masses of color out of which people and objects emerged like figures painted on air, but as distinct, impersonal, and final as a geometrical problem. She was one of those women who are called sensible by their acquaintances, meaning that they are born already disciplined and confirmed in the quieter and more orderly processes of life. Her natural intelligence having overcome the defects of her education, she thought not vaguely, but with clearness and precision, and something of this clearness and precision was revealed in her manner and in her appearance, as if she had escaped at 20 years from the impulsive judgments and the troublous solicitudes of youth. At 40 she would probably begin to grow young again, and at 50 it is not unlikely that she would turn her back upon old age forever. Just now she was too tremendously earnest about life, which she treated quite in the large manner, to take a serious interest in living. "Promise me, Jinny, that you'll never let anybody take my place," she said, turning when they had reached the head of the steps. "You silly Susan! Why, of course they shan't," replied Virginia, and they kissed ecstatically. "Nobody will ever love you as I do." "And I you, darling." With arms interlaced, they stood gazing down into the street, where the shadow of the old lamplighter glided like a ghost under the row of pale flickering lights. From a honeysuckle trellis on the other side of the porch, a penetrating sweetness came in breaths, now rising, now dying away. In Virginia's heart love stirred suddenly, and blind, wingless, imprisoned, struggled for freedom. "It is late. I must be going," said Susan. "I wish we lived near each other." "Isn't it too dark for you to go alone? John Henry will stop on his way from work, and he'll take you, if you really won't stay to supper." "No, I don't mind in the least going by myself. It isn't night anyway, and people are sitting out on their porches." A minute afterwards they parted, Susan going swiftly down High Street, while Virginia went back along the path to the porch, and passing under the Polonius, stopped beside the honeysuckle trellis, which extended to the ruined kitchen garden at the rear of the house. Once vegetables were grown here, but except for a square bed of mint, which spread heartily beneath the back windows of the dining room, the place was left now a prey to such barbarian invaders as burdock and moth mullein. On the brow of the hill, where the garden ended, there was a gnarled and twisted ailanthus tree, and from its roots the ground fell sharply to a distant view of rear enclosures and grim smoking factories. Some clothes fluttered on a line that stretched from a bough of the tree, and turning away as if they offended her, Virginia closed her eyes and breathed in the sweetness of the honeysuckle, which mingled deliciously with a strange new sense of approaching happiness in her heart. The awakening of her imagination, an event more tumultuous in its effects than the mere awakening of emotion, had changed not only her inner life, but the ordinary details of the world in which she lived. Because a young man, who differed in no appreciable manner from dozens of other young men, had gazed into her eyes for an instant, the whole universe was altered. What had been until to-day a vague, wind-driven longing for happiness, the reaching out of the dream toward the reality, had assumed suddenly a fixed and definite purpose. Her bright girlish visions had wrapped themselves in a garment of flesh. A miracle more wonderful than any she had read of had occurred in the streets of Dinwiddie, in the very spot where she had walked, with blind eyes and deaf ears, every day since she could remember. Her soul blossomed in the twilight as a flower blossoms, and shed its virginal sweetness. For the first time in her 20 years she felt that an unexplored region of happiness surrounded her. Life appeared so beautiful that she wanted to grasp and hold each fugitive sensation before it escaped her. "This is different from anything I've ever known. I never imagined it would be like this," she thought, and the next minute, "I wonder why no one has ever told me that it would happen. I wonder if it has ever really happened before, just like this, since the world began. Of all the ways I've dreamed of his coming, I never thought of this way. No, not for an instant. that I should see him first in the street like any stranger, that he should be Susan's cousin, that we should not have spoken a word before I knew it was he. Everything about him, his smile, his clothes, the way he held his head and brushed his hair straight back from his forehead, his manner of reclining with a slight slouch on the seat of the cart, the picturesque blue dotted tie he wore, his hands, his way of bowing, the red-brown of his face, and above all the eager, impetuous look in his dark eyes. These things possessed a glowing quality of interest which irradiated a delicious excitement over the bare round of living. It was enough merely to be alive and conscious that some day, tomorrow, next week, or the next hour perhaps, she might meet again the look that had caused this mixture of ecstasy and terror in her heart. The knowledge that he was in the same town with her, watching the same lights, thinking the same thoughts, breathing the same fragrance of honeysuckle, this knowledge was a fact of such tremendous importance that it dwarfed to insignificance all the proud historic past of Dinwiddie. Her imagination, seizing upon this bit of actuality, spun around it the iridescent gossamer web of her fancy. She felt that it was sufficient happiness just to stand motionless for hours and let this thought take possession of her. Nothing else mattered as long as this one thing was blissfully true. Lights came out softly like stars in the houses beyond the church tower, and in the parlor of the rectory a lamp flared up and then burned dimly under a red shade. Looking through the low window, she could see the prim set of mahogany and horsehair furniture, with its deep, heavily carved sofa midway of the opposite wall, and the 12 chairs which custom demanded arranged stiffly at equal distances on the faded Axminster carpet. For a moment her gaze rested on the claw-footed mahogany table, bearing a family Bible and a photograph album bound in morocco, on the engraving of the Burial of Lataine, between the long windows at the back of the room, on the cloudy gilt-framed mirror above the mantel with the 2 standing candelabra reflected in its surface, and all these familiar objects appeared to her as vividly as if she had not lived with them from her infancy. A new light had fallen over them, and it seemed to her that this light released an inner meaning, a hidden soul even in the claw-footed table and the threadbare Axminster carpet. Then the door into the hall opened, and her mother entered, wearing the patched black silk dress which she had bought before the war, and had turned and darned ever since with untiring fingers. Shrinking back into the dusk, Virginia watched the thin, slightly stooping figure as it stood arrested there in the subdued glow of the lamplight. She saw the pale oval face, so transparent that it was like the face of a ghost, the fine brown hair parted smoothly under the small net cap, the soft faded eyes in their hollowed and faintly bluish sockets, and the sweet patient lips with their expression of anxious sympathy, as of one who had lived not in her own joys and sorrows, but in those of others. Vaguely the girl realized that her mother had had what is called a hard life, but this knowledge brought no tremor of apprehension for herself, no shadow of disbelief in her own unquestionable right to happiness. A glorious certainty possessed her that her own life would be different from anything that had ever been in the past. The front door opened and shut. There was a step on the soft grass under the honeysuckle trellis, and her father came towards her with his long black coat flapping about him. He always wore clothes several sizes too large for him, under the impression that it was a point of economy, and that they would last longer if there was no strain put upon them. He was a small, wiry man, with an amazing amount of strength for his build, and a keen, humorous face ornamented by a pointed chin-beard, which he called his goatee. His eyes were light gray, with a twinkle which rarely left them except at the altar, and the skin of his cheeks had never lost the drawn and parchment-like look acquired during the last years of the war. One of the many martial Christians of the Confederacy, he had laid aside his surplice at the first call for troops to defend the borders, and had resumed it immediately after the surrender at Appomattox. It was still an open question in Dinwiddie whether Gabriel Pendleton, who was admitted to have been born a saint, had achieved greater distinction as a fighter or a clergyman, though he himself had accepted the opposite vocations with equal humility. Only in the dead of sweltering summer nights did he sometimes arouse his wife with a groan and the halting words, "Lucy, I can't sleep for thinking of those men I killed in the war." But with the earliest breeze of dawn his remorse usually left him, and he would rise and go about his parochial duties with the serene and childlike trust in Providence that had once carried him into battle. A militant idealism had ennobled his fighting as it now exalted his preaching. He had never in his life seen things as they are, because he had seen them always by the white flame of a soul on fire with righteousness. To reach his mind, impressions of persons or objects had first to pass through a refining atmosphere in which all baser substances were eliminated, and no fact had ever penetrated this medium except in the flattering disguise of a sentiment. Having married at 20 an idealist, only less ignorant of the world than himself, he had, inspired by her example, immediately directed his energies towards the whitewashing of the actuality. Both cherished the naive conviction that to acknowledge an evil is in a manner to countenance its existence, and both clung fervently to the belief that a pretty sham has a more intimate relation to morality than has an ugly truth. Yet so unconscious were they of weaving this elaborate tissue of illusion around the world they had inhabited, that they called the mental process by which they distorted the reality taking a true view of life. To take a true view was to believe what was pleasant against what was painful, in spite of evidence; to grant honesty to all men, with the possible exception of the Yankee army and a few local scalawags known as readjusters; to deny virtue to no woman, not even to the New England abolitionist; to regard the period before the war in Virginia as attained perfection, and the present as falling short of that perfection only inasmuch as it had occurred since the surrender. As life in a small place among a simple and guileless class of gentlefolk, all passionately cherishing the same opinions, had never shaken these illusions, it was but natural that they should have done their best to hand them down as sacred heirlooms to their only child. Even Gabriel's 4 years of hard fighting and scant rations were enkindled by so much of the disinterested idealism that had sent his state into the Confederacy, that he had emerged from them with an impoverished body but an enriched spirit. Combined with his inherent inability to face the facts of life, there was an almost superhuman capacity for cheerful recovery from the shocks of adversity. Since he had married by accident the one woman who was made for him, he had managed to preserve untarnished his innocent assumption that marriages were arranged in heaven, for the domestic infelicities of many of his parishioners were powerless to affect a belief that was founded upon a solitary personal experience. Unhappy marriages, like all other misfortunes of society, he was inclined to regard as entirely modern, and due mainly to the decay of ante-bellum institutions. I don't remember that I ever heard of a discontented servant or an unhappy marriage in my boyhood, he would say, when he was forced against his will to consider either of these disturbing problems. Not progress, but a return to the ideals of our ancestors, was his sole hope for the future, and in Virginia's childhood she had grown to regard this phrase as second in reverence only to that other familiar invocation, "if it be the will of God." As he stood now in the square of lamplight that streamed from the drawing-room window, she looked into his thin, humorous face, so spiritualized by poverty and self-sacrifice that it had become merely the veil for his soul, and the thought came to her that she had never really seen him as he was until to-day. "You're out late, daughter. Isn't it time for supper?" he asked, putting his arm about her. Beneath the simple words she felt the profound affection which he rarely expressed, but of which she was conscious whenever he looked at her or spoke to her. 2 days ago this affection, of which she never thought because it belonged to her by right, like the air she breathed, had been sufficient to fill her life to overflowing. And now, in less than a moment, the simplest accident had pushed it into the background. In the place where it had been there was a restless longing, which seemed at one instant a part of the universal stirring of the spring, and became the next an importunate desire for the coming of the lover to whom she had been taught to look as to the fulfillment of her womanhood. At times this lover appeared to have no connection with Oliver Treadwell. Then the memory of his eager and searching look would flush the world with a magic enchantment. He might pass here at any minute, she thought, and immediately every simple detail of her life was illuminated as if a quivering rosy light had fallen aslant it. His drive down High Street in the afternoon had left a trail of glory over the earthen roadbed. "Yes, I was just going in," she replied to the rector's question, and added, "How sweet the honeysuckle smells! I never knew it to be so fragrant." "The end of the trellis needs propping up. I noticed it this morning," he returned, keeping his arm around her as they passed over the short grassy walk and up the steps to the porch. Then the door of the rectory opened, and the silhouette of Mrs. Pendleton, in her threadbare black silk dress, with her cameo-like profile softened by the dark bands of her hair, showed motionless against the lighted space of the hall. "We're here, Lucy," said the rector, kissing her, and a minute later they entered the dining-room, which was on the right of the staircase. The old mahogany table, scarred by a century of service, was laid with a simple supper of bread, tea, and sliced ham on a willow dish. At one end there was a bowl of freshly gathered strawberries, with the dew still on them, and Mrs. Pendleton hastened to explain that they were a present from Tom Peachy, who had driven out into the country in order to get them. "Well, I hope his wife has some also," commented the rector. "Tom's a good fellow, but he could never keep a closed fist. There's no use denying it." Mrs. Pendleton, who had never denied anything in her life except the biblical sanction for the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, shook her head gently and began to talk in the inattentive and anxious manner she had acquired at scantily furnished tables. Ever since the war, with the exception of the Reconstruction period, when she had lived practically on charity, she had managed to exist with serenity and numerous Negro dependents on the rector's salary of $1,000 a year. Simple and wholesome food she had supplied to her family and her followers, and for their desserts, as she called the sweet things of life, she had relied with touching confidence upon her neighbors. What they would be for the day she did not know, but since poverty, not prosperity, breeds the generous heart, she was perfectly assured that when Miss Priscilla was putting up raspberries, or Mrs. Goode was making lemon pie, she should not be forgotten. During the terrible war years it had become the custom of Dinwiddie housekeepers to remember the wife of the rector, who had plucked off his surplice for the Confederacy, and among the older generation the habit still persisted, like all other links that bound them to a past which they cherished the more passionately because it guarded a defeated cause. Like the soft, apologetic murmur of Mrs. Pendleton's voice, which was meant to distract attention rather than to impart information, this impassioned memory of the thing that was dead sweetened the less romantic fact of the things that were living. The young were ignorant of it, but the old knew. Mrs. Pendleton, who was born a great lady, remained one when the props and the background of a great lady had crumbled around her, and though the part she filled was a narrow part, a mere niche in the world's history, she filled it superbly. From the dignity of possession she had passed to the finer dignity of poverty that can do without. All the intellect in her, for she was not clever, had been transmuted into character by this fiery passage from romance into reality, and though life had done its worst with her, some fine invincible blade in the depths of her being, she had never surrendered. She would have gone to the stake for a principle as cheerfully as she had descended from her aristocratic niche into unceasing poverty and self-denial, but she would have gone wearing garlands on her head, and with her faint, grave smile, in which there was almost every quality except that of humor, touching her lips. Her hands, which were once lovely, were now knotted and worn, for she had toiled when it was necessary, though she had toiled always with the manner of a lady. Even to-day it was a part of her triumph that this dignity was so vital a factor in her life that there was none of her husband's laughter at circumstances to lighten her burden. To her the daily struggle of keeping an open house on starvation fare was not a pathetic comedy, as with Gabriel, but a desperately smiling tragedy. What to Gabriel had been merely the discomfort of being poor when everybody you respected was poor with you, had been to his wife the slow agony of crucifixion. It was she, not he, who had lain awake to wonder where tomorrow's dinner could be got without begging. It was she also who had feared to doze at dawn, lest she should oversleep herself and not be downstairs in time to scrub the floors and the furniture before the neighbors were stirring. Uncle Esam, whose knees were crippled with rheumatism, and Dorcia, who had a stitch in her side whenever she stooped, were the only servants that remained with her, and the nursing of these was usually added to the pitiless drudgery of her winter. But the bitter edge to all her suffering was the feeling which her husband spoke of in the pulpit as false pride, the feeling she prayed over fervently, yet without avail, in church every Sunday, and this was the ignoble terror of being seen on her knees in her old black calico dress before she had gone upstairs again, washed her hands with cornmeal, powdered her face with her pink flannel starch bag, and descended in her breakfast gown of black cashmere or lawn, with a net scarf tied daintily around her thin throat, and a pair of exquisitely darned lace ruffles hiding her wrists. As she sat now, smiling and calm, at the head of her table, there was no hint in her face of the gnawing anxiety behind the delicate blue-veined hollows in her forehead. "I thought John Henry would come to supper," she observed, while her hands worked lovingly among the old white and gold teacups which had belonged to her mother, "so I gathered a few flowers." In the centre of the table there was a handful of garden flowers arranged, with a generous disregard of color, in a cut glass bowl, as though all blossoms were intended by their Creator to go peaceably together. Only on formal occasions was such a decoration used on the table of the rectory, since the happiest adornment for a meal was supposed to be a bountiful supply of visible viands. But the hopelessly mended mats had pierced Mrs. Pendleton's heart, and the cut glass bowl, like her endless prattle, was but a pitiful subterfuge. "Oh, I like them," Virginia had started to answer, and when a hearty voice called, "May I come in?" from the darkness, and a large, carelessly dressed young man, with an amiable and rather heavy countenance, entered the hall and passed on into the dining-room. In reply to Mrs. Pendleton's offer of tea, he answered that he had stopped at the Treadwells' on his way up from work. "I could hardly break away from Oliver," he added, "but I remembered that I'd promised Aunt Lucy to take her down to Tin Pot Alley after supper, so I made a bolt while he was convincing me that it's better to be poor with an idea, as he calls it, than rich without one." Then turning to Virginia, he asked suddenly, "What's the matter, little cousin? Been about too much in the sun?" "Oh, it's only the rose in my hair," responded Virginia, and she felt that there was a fierce joy in blushing like this, even while she told herself that she would give everything she possessed if she could only stop it. "If you aren't well, you'd better not go with us, Jinny," said Mrs. Pendleton. "It was so sweet of John Henry to remember that I'd promised to take Aunt Ailsie some of the bitters we used to make before the war. Everything was so sweet to her, the weather, her husband's sermons, the little trays that came continually from her neighbors, and she lived in a perpetual state of thankfulness for favors so insignificant that a less impressionable soul would have accepted them as undeserving of more than the barest acknowledgment. "I'm perfectly well," insisted Virginia, a little angry with John Henry because he had been the first to notice her blushes. Rising hurriedly from the table, she went to the door and stood looking out into the spangled dusk under the paulownias, while her mother wrapped the bottle in a piece of white tissue paper, and remarked with an animation which served to hide her fatigue from the unobservant eyes of her husband, that a walk would do her good on such a perfectly lovely night. Gabriel, who loved her as much as a man can love a wife who has sacrificed herself to him, wisely and unwisely, for nearly 30 years, had grown so used to seeing her suffer with a smile, that he had drifted at last into the belief that it was the only form of activity she really enjoyed. From the day of his marriage he had never been able to deny her anything she had set her heart upon, not even the privilege of working herself to death for his sake when the opportunity offered. "Well, well, if you feel like it, of course you must go, my dear," he replied. "I'll step over and sit a minute with Miss Priscilla while you are away. Never could bear the house without you, Lucy." While this protest was still on his lips, he followed her from the house, and turned with Virginia and John Henry in the direction of the young ladies' academy. From the darkness beyond the iron gate there came the soothing flow of Miss Priscilla's voice, entertaining an evening caller, and when the rector left them, as if irresistibly drawn toward the honeyed sound of gossip, Virginia walked on in silence between John Henry and her mother. At each corner a flickering street lamp burned with a thin yellow flame, and in the midst of the narrow orbit of its light several shining moths circled swiftly like white moons revolving about a sun. In the center of the blocks, where the darkness was broken only by small flower-like flakes of light that fell in clusters through boughs of mulberry or linden trees, there was the sound of whispering voices and of rustling palm-leaf fans on the crowded porches behind screens of roses or honeysuckle. Mrs. Pendleton, whose instinct prompted her to efface herself whenever she made a third at the meeting of maid and man, even though the man was only her nephew John Henry, began to talk at last after waiting modestly for her daughter to begin the conversation. The story of Aunt Ailsie, of her great age and her dictatorial temper, which made living with other servants impossible to her, started valiantly on its familiar road, and tripped but little when the poor lady realized that neither John Henry nor Virginia was listening. She was so used to talking for the sake of the sound she made, rather than the impression she produced, that her silvery ripple had become almost as lacking in self-consciousness as the song of a canary. But Virginia, walking so quietly at her side, was inhabiting at the moment a separate universe, a universe smelling of honeysuckle and filled with starry pathways to happiness. In this universe Aunt Ailsie and her peculiarities, her mother's innocent prattle, and the solid body of John Henry touching her arm, were all as remote and trivial as the night moths circling around the lamps. Looking at John Henry from under her lowered lashes, she felt a sudden pity for him because he was so far, so very far indeed, from being the right man. She saw him too clearly as he was. He stood before her in all the hard brightness of the reality, and first love, like beauty, depends less upon the truth of an outline than it does upon the softening quality of an atmosphere. There was no mystery for her in the simple fact of his being. There was nothing left to discover about his great stature, his excellent heart, and his safe, slow mind that had been compelled to forego even the sort of education she had derived from Miss Priscilla. She knew that he had left school at the age of 8 in order to become the support of a widowed mother, and she was pitifully aware of the tireless efforts he had made after reaching manhood to remedy his ignorance of the elementary studies he had missed. Never had she heard a complaint from him, never a regret for the sacrifice, never so much as an idle wonder why it should have been necessary. If the texture of his soul was not finely wrought, the proportions of it were heroic. In him the Pendleton idealism had left the skies and been transmuted into the common substance of clay. He was of a practical bent of mind, and had developed a talent for his branch of business, which, to the bitter humiliation of his mother, was that of hardware, with a successful specialty in bathtubs. Until to-day Virginia had always believed that John Henry interested her, but now she wondered how she had ever spent so many hours listening to his talk about business, and with the thought her whole existence appeared to her as dull and commonplace as those hours. A single instant of experience seemed longer to her than all the years she had lived, and this instant had drained the color and the sweetness from the rest of life. The shape of her universe had trembled suddenly and altered. Dimly she was beginning to realize that sensation, not time, is the true measure of life. Nothing and everything had happened to her since yesterday. As they turned into Short Market Street, Mrs. Pendleton's voice trailed off at last into silence, and she did not speak again while they passed hurriedly between the crumbling houses and the dilapidated shops which rose darkly on either side of the narrow cinder-strewn walks. The scent of honeysuckle did not reach here, and when they stopped presently at the beginning of Tin Pot Alley, there floated out to them the sharp, acrid odor of huddled negroes. In these squalid alleys, where the lamps burned at longer distances, the more primitive forms of life appeared to swarm, like distorted images under the transparent civilization of the town. The sound of banjo strumming came faintly from the dimness beyond, while at their feet the problem of the South sprawled innocently amid tomato cans and rotting cabbage leaves. "Wait here just a minute, and I'll run up and speak to Aunt Ailsie," remarked Mrs. Pendleton, with the dignity of a soul that is superior to smells, and without noticing her daughter's reproachful nod of acquiescence, she entered the alley and disappeared through the doorway of the nearest hovel. A minute later, her serene face looked down at them over a patchwork quilt which hung airing at half length from the window above. But this is not life. It has nothing to do with life, thought Virginia, while the Pendleton blood in her rose in a fierce rebellion against all that was ugly and sordid in existence. Then her mother's tread was heard descending the short flight of steps, and the sensation vanished as quickly and as inexplicably as it had come. "I tried not to keep you waiting, dear," said Mrs. Pendleton, hastening toward them, while she fanned herself rapidly with the small black fan she carried. Her face looked tired and worn, and before moving on she paused a moment and held her hand to her thin, fluttering breast, while deep bluish circles appeared to start out under the expression of pathetic cheerfulness in her eyes. This pathetic cheerfulness, so characteristic of the women of her generation, was the first thing, perhaps, that a stranger would have noticed about her face, yet it was a trait which neither her husband nor her child had ever observed. There was a fine moisture on her forehead, and this added so greatly to the natural transparency of her features that, standing there in the wan light, she might have been mistaken for the phantom of her daughter's vivid flesh and blood beauty. "I wonder if you would mind going on to Bolingbroke Street, so I may speak to Belinda Treadwell a minute?" she asked as soon as she had recovered her breath. "I want to find out if she has engaged Miss Willie Whitlow for the whole week, or if there is any use my sending a message to her over in Botetourt. If she doesn't begin at once, Jenny, you won't have a dress to wear to Abby Good's party." Virginia's heart gave a single bound of joy, and lay quiet. Not for worlds would she have asked to go to the Treadwells', yet ever since they had started she had longed unceasingly to have her mother suggest it. The very stars, she felt, had worked together to bring about her desire. "But aren't you tired, mother? It really doesn't matter about my dress," she murmured, for it was not in vain that she had wrested a diploma for deportment from Miss Priscilla. "Why can't I take the message for you, Aunt Lucy? You look tired to death," urged John Henry. "Oh, I shan't mind the walk as soon as we get out into the breeze," replied Mrs. Pendleton. "It's a lovely night, only a little close in this alley." And as she spoke she looked gently down on the problem of the South, as the Southern women had looked down on it for generations, and would continue to look down on it for generations still to come, without seeing that it was a problem. "Well, it's good to get a breath of air, anyway," exclaimed John Henry with fervor, when they had passed out of the alley into the lighted street. Around them the town seemed to beat with a single heart, as if it waited, like Virginia, in breathless suspense for some secret that must come out of the darkness. Sometimes the sidewalks over which they passed were of flagstone, sometimes they were of gravel or of strewn cinders. Now and then an old stone house, which had once sheltered crinoline and lace ruffles, or had served as a trading station with the Indians before Dinwiddie had become a city, would loom between two small shops where the owners, coatless and covered with sweat, were selling flat beer to jaded and miserable customers. Up Bolingbroke Street a faint breeze blew, lifting the moist satin-like hair on Mrs. Pendleton's forehead. Already its ancient dignity had deserted the quarter in which the Treadwells lived, and it had begun to wear a forsaken and injured look, as though it resented the degradation of commerce into which it had descended. "I can't understand why Cyrus Treadwell doesn't move over to Sycamore Street," remarked John Henry, after a moment of reflection in which he had appeared to weigh this simple sentence with scrupulous exactness. "He's rich enough, I suppose, to buy anything he wants." "I've heard Susan say that it was her mother's old home, and she didn't care to leave it," said Mrs. Pendleton. "I don't believe it's that a bit," broke in Virginia with characteristic impulsiveness. "The only reason is that Mr. Treadwell is stingy. With all his money, I know Mrs. Treadwell and Susan hardly ever have a dollar they can spend on themselves." Though she spoke with her accustomed energy, she was conscious all the time that the words she uttered were not the ones in her thoughts. What did Cyrus Treadwell's stinginess matter, when his only relation to life consisted in his being the uncle of Oliver? It was as if a single shape moved alive through a universe peopled with shadows. Only a borrowed radiance attached itself now to the persons and objects that had illumined the world for her yesterday. Yet she approached the crisis of her life so silently that those around her did not recognize it beneath the cover of ordinary circumstances. Like most great moments, it had come unheralded, and though the rustling of its wings filled her soul, neither her mother nor John Henry heard a stir in the quiet air that surrounded them. Walking between the two who loved her, she felt that she was separated from them both by an eternity of experience. There were several blocks of Bolingbroke Street to walk before the Treadwells' house was reached, and as they sauntered slowly past decayed dwellings, Virginia's imagination ran joyously ahead of her to the meeting. Would it happen this time, as it had happened before, when he looked at her, that something would pass between them which would make her feel that she belonged to him? So little resistance did she offer to the purpose of life, that she seemed to have existed from the beginning merely as an exquisite medium for a single emotion. It was as if the dreams of all the dead women of her race, who had lived only in loving, were concentrated into a single shining centre of bliss, for the accumulated vibrations of centuries were in her soul when she trembled for the first time beneath the eyes of a lover. And yet all this blissful violence was powerless to change the most insignificant external fact in the universe. Though it was the greatest thing that could ever happen to her, it was nothing to the other 21,000 human beings among whom she lived. It left no mark upon that procession of unimportant details which they called life. They were in sight of the small, old-fashioned brick house of the Treadwells, with its narrow windows set discreetly between outside shutters, and she saw that the little marble porch was deserted except for the two pink oleander trees which stood in green tubs on either side of the curved iron railings. A minute later John Henry's imperative ring brought a young colored maid to the door, and Virginia, who had lingered on the pavement, heard almost immediately an effusive duet from her mother and Mrs. Treadwell. "Oh, do come in, Lucy, just for a minute." "I can't possibly, my dear. I only wanted to ask you if you have engaged Miss Willie Whitlow for the entire week, or if you could let me have her for Friday and Saturday. Jenny hasn't a rag to wear to Abby Goode's lawn party, and I don't know anybody who does quite so well for her as poor Miss Willie. Oh, that's so sweet of you. I can't thank you enough. And you'll tell her without my sending all the way over to Botetourt." By this time Susan had joined Virginia on the sidewalk, and the liquid honey of Mrs. Pendleton's voice dropped softly into indistinctness. "Oh, Jenny, if I'd only known you were coming," said Susan. "Oliver wanted me to take him to see you, and when I couldn't, he went over to call on Abby." So this was the end of her walk, winged with expectancy. A disappointment as sharp as her joy had been pierced her through as she stood there smiling into Susan's discomfited face. With the tragic power of youth to create its own torment, she told herself that life could never be the same after this first taste of its bitterness. End of Book 1, Chapter 2. Book 1, Chapter 3 of Virginia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Virginia by Ellen Glasgow. Book 1, The Dream, Chapter 3, First Love. The next morning, so indestructible is the happiness of youth, she awoke with her hope as fresh as if it had not been blighted the evening before. As she lay in bed with her loosened hair making a cloud over the pillows, and her eyes shining like blue flowers in the band of sunlight that fell through the dormer window, she quivered to the early sweetness of honeysuckle as though it were the charmed sweetness of love of which she had dreamed in the night. She was only one of the many millions of women who were awaking at the same hour to the same miracle of nature, yet she might have been the first woman seeking the first man through the vastness and the mystery of an uninhabited earth. Impossible to believe that an experience so wonderful was as common as the bursting of the spring buds or the humming of the thirsty bees around the honeysuckle arbor. Slipping out of bed, she threw her dressing gown over her shoulders, and kneeling beside the window, drank in the flower-scented air of the May morning. During the night the paulownia trees had shed a rain of violet blossoms over the wet grass, where little wings of sunshine, like golden moths, hovered above them. Beyond the border of lilies of the valley, she saw the squat, pinkish tower of the church, and beneath it in the narrow churchyard rose the gleaming shaft above the grave of the Confederate soldier. On her right, in the center of the crooked path, 3 negro infants were prodding earnestly at roots of wiregrass and dandelion, and brushing carelessly their huddled figures, her gaze descended the 12 steps of the almost obliterated terrace, and followed the steep street down which a mulatto vegetable vendor was urging his slow-footed mule. A wave of joy rose in her breast, and she felt that her heart melted in gratitude for the divine beauty of life. The world showed to her as a place filled with shining vistas of happiness, and at the end of each of these vistas there awaited the unknown, enchanting thing which she called in her thoughts the future. The fact that it was the same world in which Miss Priscilla and her mother lived their narrow and prosaic lives did not alter by a breath her unshakable conviction that she herself was predestined for something more wonderful than they had ever dreamed of. He may come this evening, she thought, and immediately the light of magic suffused the room, the street outside, and every scarred roof in Dinwiddie. At the head of her bed, wedged in between the candle-stand and the window, there was a cheap little bookcase of walnut, which contained the only volumes she had ever been permitted to own, the poems of Mrs. Hemans and of Adelaide Ann Proctor, a carefully expurgated edition of Shakespeare with an inscription in the rector's handwriting on the fly-leaf, Miss Strickland's Lives of the Queens of England, and several works of fiction belonging to the class which Mrs. Pendleton vaguely characterized as sweet stories. Among the more prominent of these were Thaddeus of Warsaw, a complete set of Miss Young's novels, with a conspicuously tear-stained volume of The Heir of Redcliffe, and a romance or two by obscure but innocuous authors. That any book which told, however mildly, the truth about life should have entered their daughter's bedroom would have seemed little short of profanation to both the rector and Mrs. Pendleton. The sacred shelves of that bookcase, which had been ceremoniously presented to her on her 14th birthday, had never suffered the contaminating presence of realism. The solitary purpose of art was, in Mrs. Pendleton's eyes, to be sweet, and she scrupulously judged all literature by its success or failure in this particular quality. It seemed to her as wholesome to feed her daughter's growing fancy on an imaginary line of pious heroes, as it appeared to her moral to screen her from all suspicion of the existence of immorality. She did not honestly believe that any living man resembled the heir of Redcliffe any more than she believed that the path of self-sacrifice leads inevitably to happiness, but there was no doubt in her mind that she advanced the cause of righteousness when she taught these sanctified fallacies to Virginia. As she rose from her knees, Virginia glanced at her white dress, which was too crumpled for her to wear again before it was smoothed, and thought regretfully of Aunt Docia's heart, which invariably gave warning whenever there was extra work to be done. "I shall have to wear either my blue lawn or my green organdy this evening," she thought. "I wish I could have the sleeves changed. I wonder if mother could run a tuck in them." It did not occur to her that she might smooth the dress herself, because she knew that the iron would be wrested from her by her mother's hands, which were so knotted and worn that tears came to Virginia's eyes when she looked at them. She let her mother slave over her because she had been born into a world where the slaving of mothers was a part of the natural order, and she had not as yet become independent enough to question the morality of the commonplace. At any minute she would gladly have worked too, but the phrase "spare Virginia" had been uttered so often in her hearing that it had acquired at last almost a religious significance. To have been forced to train her daughter in any profitable occupation, which might have lifted her out of the class of unskilled labour in which indigent gentlewomen by right belonged, would have been the final dregs of humiliation in Mrs. Pendleton's cup. On one of Aunt Docia's bad days, when Jinny had begged to be allowed to do part of the washing, she had met an almost passionate refusal from her mother. "It will be time enough to spoil your hands after you are married, darling." And again, "Don't do that rough sewing, Jinny. Give it to me." From the cradle she had borne her part in this racial custom, of the sacrifice of generation to generation, of the perpetual immolation of age on the flowery altars of youth. Like most customs in which we are nurtured, it had seemed natural and pleasant enough until she had watched the hollows deepen in her mother's temples, and the tireless knotted hands stumble at their work. Then a pang had seized her, and she had pleaded earnestly to be permitted to help. "If you only knew how unhappy it makes me to see you ruining your pretty fingers, Jinny. My child, the one comfort I have is the thought that I'm sparing you." Sparing her! Always that from the first. Even Gabriel chimed in when it became a matter of Jinny. "Let me wash the dishes, Lucy," he would implore. "What? Will you trust me with other people's souls, but not with your china?" "It's not a man's work, Mr. Pendleton. What would the neighbours think?" "They would think, I hope, my dear, that I was doing my duty. But it would not be dignified for a clergyman. No, I cannot bear the sight of you with a dishcloth." In the end she invariably had her way with them, for she was the strongest. Jinny must be spared, and Gabriel must do nothing undignified. About herself it made no difference unless the neighbours were looking. She had not thought of herself except in the indomitable failing of her false pride since her marriage, which had taken place in her 20th year. A clergyman's wife might do menial tasks in secret, and nobody minded, but they were not for a clergyman. For a minute, while she was dressing, Virginia thought of these things, of how hard life had been to her mother, of how pretty she must have been in her youth. What she did not think of was that her mother, like herself, was but one of the endless procession of women who pass perpetually from the sphere of pleasure into the sphere of service. It was as impossible for her to picture her mother as a girl of 20 as it was for her to imagine herself ever becoming a woman of 50. When she had finished dressing, she closed the door softly after her, as if she were afraid of disturbing the silence, and ran downstairs to the dining-room, where the rector and Mrs. Pendleton greeted her with subdued murmurs of joy. "I was afraid I'd miss you, daughter," from the rector as he drew her chair nearer. "I was just going to carry up your tray, Jenny," from her mother. "I kept a nice breast of chicken for you, which one of the neighbours sent me." "I'd so much rather you'd eat it, mother," protested Jenny, on the point of tears. "But I couldn't, darling. I really couldn't manage it. A cup of coffee and a bit of toast is all I can possibly stand in the morning. I was up early, for Dosia was threatened with one of her heart attacks, and it always gives me a little headache to miss my morning nap." "Then you can't go to market, Lucy. It is out of the question," insisted the rector. "After 30 years you might as well make up your mind to trust me, my dear." "But the last time you went you gave away our shoulder of lamb to a beggar," replied his wife, and she hastened to add tenderly, lest he should accept the remark as a reproof, "It's sweet of you, dearest, but a little walk will be good for my head, if I'm careful to keep on the shady side of the street. I can easily find a boy to bring home the things, and I'm sure it won't hurt me a bit." "Why can't I go, mother?" implored Virginia. "Susan always markets for Mrs. Treadwell." And she felt that even the task of marketing was irradiated by this inner glow which had changed the common aspect of life. "Oh, Jenny, you know how you hate to feel the chickens, and one can never tell how plump they are by the feathers." "Well, I'll feel them, mother, if you'll let me try." "No, darling, but you may go with me and carry my sunshade. I'm so sorry Dosia can't smooth your dress. Was it much crumpled?" "Oh, dreadfully, and I did so want to wear it this evening. Do you think Aunt Dosia could show me how to iron?" Dosia, who stood like an ebony image of Bellona behind her mistress's chair, waving a variegated tissue paper fly-screen over the coffee urn, was heard to think aloud that "dish year stitch ain't helt up er blessed minute since befo' daylight." Not naturally, perhaps, since she was the most prominent figure in her own vision of the universe, she had come at last to regard her recurrent stitch as an event of greater consequence than Virginia's appearance in immaculate white muslin. An uncertain heart, combined with a certain temper, had elevated her from a servile position to one of absolute autocracy in the household. Everybody feared her, so nobody had ever dared ask her to leave. As she had rebelled long ago against the badge of a cap and an apron, she appeared in the dining-room clad in garments of various hues, and her dress on this particular morning was a purple calico crowned majestically by a pink cotton turban. There was a tradition still afloat that Dosia had been an excellent servant before the war, but this amiable superstition had perhaps as much reason to support it as had Gabriel's innocent conviction that there were no faithless husbands when there were no divorces. "I'm afraid Dosia can't do it," sighed Mrs. Pendleton, for her ears had caught the faint thunder of the war goddess behind her chair, and her soul, which feared neither armies nor adversities, trembled before her former slaves. "But it won't take me a minute if you'll have it ready right after dinner." "Oh, mother, of course I couldn't let you for anything. I only thought Aunt Dosia might be able to teach me how to iron." At this Dosia muttered audibly that she ain't got no time to be showin' nobody nothin'. "There now, Dosia, you mustn't lose your temper," observed Gabriel as he rose from his chair. It was at such moments that the remembered joys of slavery left a bitter aftertaste on his lips. Clearly it was impossible to turn into the streets a servant who had once belonged to you. When they were in the hall together, Mrs. Pendleton whispered nervously to her husband that it must be poor Dosia's heart that made her so disagreeable, and that she would feel better to-morrow. "Wouldn't it be possible, my dear?" inquired the rector in his pulpit manner, to which his wife's only answer was a startled "Sh—sh—ush." An hour later the door of Gabriel's study opened softly, and Mrs. Pendleton entered with the humble and apologetic manner in which she always intruded upon her husband's pursuits. There was an accepted theory in the family, shared even by Uncle Isam and Aunt Docia, that whenever Gabriel was left alone for an instant, his thoughts naturally deflected into spiritual paths. In the early days of his marriage he had tried honestly to live up to this exalted idea of his character. Then, finding the effort beyond him, and being a man with an innate detestation of hypocrisy, he had earnestly endeavored to disabuse his wife's imagination of the mistaken belief in his divinity. But a notion once firmly fixed in Mrs. Pendleton's mind might as well have been embedded in rock. By virtue of that gentle obstinacy which enabled her to believe in an illusion the more intensely because it had vanished, she had triumphed not only over circumstances but over truth itself. By virtue of this quality she had created the world in which she moved and had wrought beauty out of chaos. "Are you busy with your sermon, dear?" she asked, pausing in the doorway and gazing reverently at her husband over the small black silk bag she carried. Like the other women in Dinwiddie who had lost relatives by the war, she had never laid aside her mourning since the surrender, and the frame of crape to her face gave her the pensive look of one who has stepped out of the pageant of life into the sacred shadows of memory. "No, no, Lucy, I'm ready to start out with you," replied the rector apologetically, putting a box of fishing tackle he had been sorting back into the drawer of his desk. He was as fond as a child of a day's sport, and never quite so happy as when he set out with his rod and an old tomato can filled with worms, which he had dug out of the back garden, in his hands. But owing to the many calls upon him, and his wife's conception of his clerical dignity, he was seldom able to gratify his natural tastes. "Oh, father, please hurry," called Virginia from the porch, and rising obediently, he followed Mrs. Pendleton through the hall and out into the May sunshine, where the little negroes stopped in excited chase of a black and orange butterfly, to return doggedly to their weeding. "Are you sure you wouldn't rather I'd go to market, Lucy?" "Quite sure, dear," replied his wife, sniffing the scent of lilies of the valley with her delicate, slightly pinched nostrils. "I thought you were going to see Mr. Treadwell about putting John Henry into the bank," she added. "It is such a pity to keep the poor boy selling bath-tubs. His mother felt it so terribly." "Ah, so I was," reflected Gabriel, who, though both of them would have been indignant at the suggestion, was as putty in the hands of his wife. "Well, I'll look into the bank on Cyrus after I've paid my sick calls." With that they parted, Gabriel going on to visit a bedridden widow in the old lady's home, while Mrs. Pendleton and Virginia turned down a cross street that led toward the market. At every corner, it seemed to Virginia, middle-aged ladies, stout or thin, wearing crape veils and holding small black silk bags in their hands, sprang out of the shadows of mulberry trees and barred their leisurely progress. And though nothing had happened in Dinwiddie since the war, and Mrs. Pendleton had seen many of these ladies the day before, she stopped for a sympathetic chat with each one of them, while Virginia, standing a little apart, patiently prodded the cinders of the walk with the end of her sunshade. All her life the girl had been taught to regard time as the thing of least importance in the universe, but occasionally, while she listened in silence to the liquid murmur of her mother's voice, she wondered vaguely how the day's work was ever finished in Dinwiddie. The story of Docia's impertinence was told and retold a dozen times before they reached the market. "And you really mean that you can't get rid of her? Why, my dear Lucy, I wouldn't stand it a day. Now there was my Mandy, such an excellent servant until she got her head turned." This from Mrs. Tom Peachey, an energetic little woman with a rosy face and a straight grey bang cut short over her eyebrows. "But, Lucy, my child, are you doing right to submit to impertinence? In the old days, I remember, before the war." This from Mrs. William Goode, who had been Sally Peterson, the beauty of Dinwiddie, and who was still superbly handsome in a tragic fashion, with a haunted look in her eyes and masses of snow-white hair under her mourning bonnet. Years ago Virginia had imagined her as dwelling perpetually with the memory of her young husband, who had fallen in his 25th year in the Battle of Cold Harbor. But she knew now that the haunted eyes, like all things human, were under the despotism of trifles. To the girl, who saw in this universal acquiescence in littleness merely the pitiful surrender of feeble souls, there was a passionate triumph in the thought that her own dreams were larger than the actuality that surrounded her. Youth's scorn of the narrow details of life left no room in her mind for an understanding of the compromise which middle age makes with necessity. The pathos of resignation, of that inevitable submission to the petty powers which the years bring, was lost upon the wistful ignorance of inexperience. While she waited dutifully with her absent gaze fixed on the old mulberry trees, which whitened as the wind blew over them, and then slowly darkened again, she wondered if servants and gossip were the only things that Oliver had heard of in his travels. Then she remembered that even in Dinwiddie men were less interested in such matters than they were in the industries of peanuts and tobacco. Was it only women, after all, who were in subjection to particulars? When they turned into Old Street, John Henry hailed them from the doorway of a shop, where he stood flanked by a row of spotless bathtubs. He wore a loose, pongee coat, which sagged at the shoulders. His straight flaxen hair had been freshly cut, and his crimson necktie had got a stain on it at breakfast. But to Virginia's astonishment he appeared sublimely unconscious both of his bathtubs and his appearance. He was doubtless under the delusion that a pongee coat, being worn for comfort, was entirely successful when it achieved that end, and as for his business, it was beyond his comprehension that a Pendleton could have reason to blush for a bathtub, or for any other object that afforded him an honest livelihood. He called to them at sight, and Mrs. Pendleton, following her instinct of fitness, left the conversation to youth. "John Henry, father is going to see Mr. Treadwell about the place in the bank. Won't it be lovely if he gives it to you?" "He won't," replied John Henry. "I'll bet you anything he's keeping it for his nephew." Virginia's blush came quickly, and turning her head away, she gazed earnestly down the street to the octagonal market, which stood on the spot where slaves were offered for sale when she was born. "Mr. Treadwell is crossing the street now," she said after a minute. "I wonder why he keeps his mouth shut so tight when he is alone." A covered cart which had been passing slowly moved up the hill, and from beyond it there appeared a tall, spare figure of a man with iron-grey hair curling a little on the temples, a sallow skin splotched with red over the nose, and narrow, colourless lips that looked as if they were cut out of steel. As he walked quickly up the street, every person whom he passed turned to glance after him. "I wonder if it is true that he hasn't made his money honestly?" asked Virginia. "Oh, I hope not!" exclaimed Mrs. Pendleton, who, in her natural desire to believe only good about people, was occasionally led into believing the truth. "Well, I don't care," retorted Virginia. "He's mean. I know just by the way his wife dresses." "Oh, Jinny!" gasped Mrs. Pendleton, and glanced in embarrassment at her nephew, whose face, to her surprise, was beaming with enjoyment. The truth was that John Henry, who would have condemned so unreasonable an accusation had it been uttered by a full-grown male, was enraptured by the piquancy of hearing it on the lovely lips of his cousin. To demand that a pretty woman should possess the mental responsibility of a human being would have seemed an affront to his inherited ideas of gallantry. His slow wit was enslaved by Jinny's audacity as completely as his kind ox-like eyes were enthralled by the young red and white of her beauty. "But he's a great man. You can't deny that," he said, with the playful manner in which he might have prodded a kitten in order to make it claw. "A great man, just because he has made money?" "Well, he couldn't have got rich, you know, if he hadn't had the sense to see how to do it," replied the young man with enthusiasm. Like most Southerners who had been forced without preparation into the hard school of industry, he had found that his standards followed inevitably the changing measure of his circumstances. From his altered point of view, the part of owing property appeared so easy, and the part of winning it so difficult, that his respect for culture had yielded almost unconsciously to his admiration for commerce. When the South came again to the front, he felt instinctively that it would come, shorn of its traditional plumage, a victor from the hard-fought industrial battlefields of the century, and because Cyrus Treadwell led the way toward this triumph, he was ready to follow him. Of the whole town, this grim, half-legendary figure, passionately revered and as passionately hated, appeared to him to stand alone, not for the decaying past, but for the growing future. The stories of the too rapid development of the Treadwell fortune he cast scornfully aside as the malicious slanders of failure. What did all this tittle-tattle about a great man prove anyhow, except his greatness? Suppose he had used his railroad to make a fortune? Well, but for him, where would the Dinwiddie and Central be today, if not in the junk shop? Where would the lumber market be, the cotton market, the tobacco market? For around Cyrus, standing alone and solitary on his height, there had gathered the great illusion that makes theft honest and falsehood truth, the illusion of success. And simple John Henry Pendleton, who, after 19 years of poverty and memory, was bereft alike of classical pedantry and of physical comforts, had grown a little weary of the endless lip-worship of a single moment in history. Granted even that it was the greatest moment the world had seen, still, why couldn't one be satisfied to have it take its place beside the wars of the Spartans and of the ancient Britons? Perpetual mourning was well enough for ladies in crape veils and heroic gentlemen on crutches, but when your bread and meat depended not upon the graves you had decorated, but upon the bathtubs you had sold, surely something could be said for the Treadwell point of view. As Virginia could find no answer to this remark, the three stood in silence, gazing dreamily with 3 pairs of Pendleton eyes down toward the site of the old slave market. Directly in their line of vision, an overladen mule with a sore shoulder was straining painfully under the lash, but none of them saw it, because each of them was morally incapable of looking an unpleasant fact in the face if there was any honorable manner of avoiding it. What they beheld, indeed, was the most interesting street in the world, filled with the most interesting people who drove happy animals that enjoyed their servitude and needed the sound of the lash to add cheer and liveliness to their labors. Never had the Pendleton idealism achieved a more absolute triumph over the actuality. "Well, we must go on," murmured Mrs. Pendleton, withdrawing her visionary gaze from the hot street littered with fruit rinds and blood-stained papers from a neighboring butcher's shop. "It was lovely to have this glimpse of you, John Henry. What nice bathtubs you have." Smiling her still lovely smile into the young man's eyes, she proceeded on her leisurely way, while Virginia raised the black sunshade over her head. In front of them they could see long rows of fish carts and vegetable stalls, around which hovered an army of eager housekeepers. The social hours in Dinwiddie at that period were the early morning ones in the old market, and Virginia knew that she should hear Dosia's story repeated again for the benefit of the curious or sympathetic listeners that would soon gather about her mother. Mrs. Pendleton's marketing, unlike the hurried and irresponsible sort of to-day, was an affair of time and ceremony. Among the greetings and the condolences from other marketers there would ensue lengthy conversations with the vendors of poultry, of fish, or of vegetables. Every vegetable must be carefully selected by her own hands and laid aside into her special basket, which was in the anxious charge of a small colored urchin. While she felt the plump breasts of Mr. Dewlap's chickens, she would inquire with flattering condescension after the members of Mr. Dewlap's family. Not only did she remember each one of them by name, but she never forgot either the dates of their birthdays or the number of turkeys Mrs. Dewlap had raised in a season. If marketing is ever to be elevated from an occupation to an art, it will be by a return to Mrs. Pendleton's method. "Mother, please buy some strawberries," begged Virginia. "Darling, you know we never buy fruit or desserts. Somebody will certainly send us something. I saw Mrs. Carrington whipping Cellebub on her back porch as we passed. But they're only 5 cents a basket." "Well, put a basket with my marketing, Mr. Dewlap. Yes, I'll take the white pullet, if you're sure that she is plumper than the red one." She moved on a step or two, while the white pullet was handed over by its feet to the small colored urchin and to destruction. If Mrs. Pendleton had ever reflected on the tragic fate of pullets, she would probably have concluded that it was best for them to be fried and eaten, or Providence, whose merciful wisdom she never questioned, would not have permitted it. So in the old days she had known where the slave market stood, without realizing in the least that men and women were sold there. Poor things, it does seem dreadful, but I suppose it is better for them to have a change sometimes, she would doubtless have reasoned, had the horror of the custom ever occurred to her, for her heart was so sensitive to pain that she could exist at all only by inventing a world of exquisite fiction around her. "Aren't you nearly through, mother?" pleaded Virginia at last. "The sun will be so hot going home that it will make your head worse." Mrs. Pendleton, who was splitting a pea shell with her thumb in order to ascertain the size and quality of the peas, murmured soothingly, "Just a minute, dear," and the girl, finding it impossible to share her mother's enthusiasm for slaughtered animals, fell back again into the narrow shade of the stalls. She revolted with a feeling of outrage against the side of life that confronted her, against the dirty floor, strewn with withered vegetables above which flies swarmed incessantly, and against the pathos of the small bleeding forms which seemed related neither to the lamb in the fields nor to the Sunday roast on the table. That divine gift of evasion, which enabled Mrs. Pendleton to see only the things she wanted to see in every occurrence, was but partially developed as yet in Virginia, and while she stood there in the midst of her unromantic surroundings, the girl shuddered lest Oliver Treadwell should know that she had ever waited hot, perspiring, with a draggle skirt and a bag of tomatoes grasped in her hands, while her mother wandered from stall to stall in a tireless search for peas a few cents cheaper than those of Mr. Dewlap. Youth, with its ingenuous belief that love dwells in external circumstances, was protesting against the bland assumption of age that love creates its own peculiar circumstances out of itself. It was absurd, she knew, to imagine that her father's affection for her mother would alter because she haggled over the price of peas, yet the emotion with which she endowed Oliver Treadwell was so delicate and elusive that she felt that the sight of a soiled skirt and a perspiring face would blast it for ever. It appeared imperative that he should see her in white muslin, and she resolved that if it cost Dosia her life, she would have the flounces of her dress smoothed before evening. She, who was by nature almost morbidly sensitive to suffering, became, in the hands of this new and implacable power, as ruthless as fate. "Now I'm ready, Jinny dear. Are you tired waiting?" asked Mrs. Pendleton, coming toward her with a coloured urchin in her train. "Why, there's Susan Treadwell. Have you spoken to her?" The next instant, before the startled girl could turn, a voice cried out triumphantly, "Oh, Jinny!" and in front of her, looking over Susan's shoulder, she saw the eager eyes and the thin, high-coloured face of Oliver Treadwell. For a moment she told herself that he had read her thoughts with his penetrating gaze, which seemed to pierce through her, and she blushed pink while her eyes burned under her trembling lashes. Then the paper bag containing the tomatoes burst in her hands, and its contents rolled one by one over the littered floor to his feet. Both stooped at once to recover it, and while their hands touched amid wilted cabbage leaves, the girl felt that love had taken gilded wings and departed for ever. "Put them in the basket, dear," Mrs. Pendleton could be heard saying calmly in the midst of her daughter's agony. For having lived through the brief illumination of romance, she had come at last into that steady glow which encompasses the commonplace. "This is my cousin Oliver, Virginia," remarked Susan, as casually as if the meeting of the two had not been planned from all eternity by the beneficent powers. "I'm afraid I've spoiled your nice red tomatoes," said a voice that filled Virginia's whirling mind with a kind of ecstatic dizziness. As the owner of the voice held out his hand, she saw that it was long and thin, like the rest of him, with blue veins crossing the back, and slender, slightly crooked fingers that hurt hers with the strength of their pressure. "To confess the truth," he added gaily after an instant, "my breath was quite taken away, because somehow this was the last place on earth in which I expected to find you. It's a dreadful spot, don't you think so? If we've got to be cannibals, why in heaven's name make a show and a parade of it?" "What an extraordinary young man," said Mrs. Pendleton's eyes, and Virginia found herself blushing again because she felt that her mother had not understood him. A delicious embarrassment, something different and more vivid than any sensation she had ever known, held her speechless while he looked at her. Had her life depended on it, she could not have uttered a sentence, could hardly even have lifted her lashes, which seemed suddenly to have become so heavy that she felt the burden of them weighing over her eyes. All the picturesque phrases she had planned to speak at their first meeting had taken wings with perfidious romance, yet she would have given her dearest possession to have been able to say something really clever. "He thinks me a simpleton, of course," she thought, perfectly unconscious that Oliver was not thinking of her wits at all, but of the wonderful rose pink of her flesh. At one and the same instant she felt that this silence was the most marvellous thing that had ever happened to her, and longed to break it with some speech so brilliant that he would never forget it. Little thrills of joy like tiny flames ran over her, and the light in her eyes shone on him through the quivering dusk of her lashes. Even when she looked away from him, she could still see his expression of tender gaiety, as though he were trying in vain to laugh himself free from an impulse that was fast growing too strong for him. What she did not know was that the spring was calling to him through her youth and sex, as it was calling through the scented winds and the young buds on the trees. She was as ignorant that she offered herself to him through her velvet softness, through the glow in her eyes, through her quivering lips, as the flower is that it lures the bee by its perfume. So subtly did life use her for its end that the illusion of choice in first love remained unimpaired. Though she was young desire incarnate, he saw in her only the unique and solitary woman of his dreams. "Do you come here every day?" he asked, and immediately the blue sky and the octagonal market spun round at his voice. As nothing but commonplace words would come to her, she was obliged at last to utter them. "Oh, no, not every day. I've always had a tremendous sympathy for women because they have to market and housekeep. I wonder if they won't revolt some time." This was so heretical a point of view that she tried earnestly to comprehend it, but all the time her heart was busy telling her how different he was from every other man, how much more interesting, how immeasurably superior. Her attention, in spite of her efforts at serious thought, would not wander from the charm of his voice, from the peculiar whimsical trick of his smile, which lifted his mouth at one corner and made odd little wrinkles come and go about his eyes. His manner was full of sudden nervous gestures which surprised and enchanted her. All other men were not merely as clay beside him, they were as straw, Seeing that he was waiting for a response, she made a violent endeavour to think of one, and uttered almost inaudibly, "But don't they like it?" "Ah, that's just it," he answered as seriously as if she hadn't known that her speech bordered on imbecility. "Do they really like it, or have they been throwing dust in our eyes through the centuries?" And he gazed at her as eagerly as if he were hanging upon her answer. Oh, if she could only say something clever, if she could only say the sort of thing that would shock Miss Priscilla! But nothing came of her wish, and she was reduced at last to the pathetic rejoinder, "I don't know. I'm afraid I've never thought about it." For a moment he stared at her as though he were enraptured by her reply. With such eyes and such hair, she might have been as simple as she appeared, and he would never have known it. "Of course you haven't, or you wouldn't be you," he responded, and by the time she came to her senses she was following her mother and the negro urchin out of the market. Though she was in reality walking over cinders, she felt that her feet were treading on golden air. End of Book 1, Chapter 3.